The Franco-Prussian War was arguably one of the most impactful conflicts of the 19th century. This was primarily due to the monumental ramifications that followed the end of the war. A new nation was born, and an old nation was internationally humiliated. From that point on, a rivalry was manifested between the two powers, a rivalry that would culminate on the fields of the First World War. But before the post-war effects can be assessed, one major question poses itself about the war. How did the Empire of France, a country that just decades prior conquered all of Europe, lose to a confederation of German states? Moreover, which battle was the turning point of this war? That's what we're here to discuss today. To answer these questions, we first need to take a look at the militaries of both France and Prussia in 1870. So let's start with leadership. France had three prominent military commanders: Marshal François-Achille Bazaine, Marshal Patrice MacMahon, and the Emperor Napoleon III himself. Bazaine was a very distinguished general by the time of the Franco-Prussian War. Of all of the French commanders, only he was truly aware of how dangerous the Prussians were. The second French commander, MacMahon, was a descendant of Irish nobility. His actions during the war seemed to indicate a certain degree of indecision and hesitancy. And lastly, Emperor Napoleon III, the head of the French imperial regime, looks to be, through his inaction in the war, the most incompetent of the other French generals. We can see this as halfway through the war he would cede command to Marshal Bazaine. On the German side, there were just two distinguished commanders, Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke and King Wilhelm I. Moltke was the son of a Danish general, and proved to be an excellent and insightful commander, who knew how to employ railroads properly and distribute troops. King Wilhelm was the grandson of Frederick II of Prussia, and thus was not expected to ascend to the throne. For this reason, his father appointed him as an officer in the Prussian army, and so Wilhelm would participate in the Napoleonic Wars, where he was able to gain considerable amounts of military experience. And so with all of that said, Prussia did hold an advantage with leadership at this time. Now on to drill and tactics. Each army had a very different way of training their militaries. The Prussian model was decidedly more efficient. The doctrines of the Prussian army were taught to all officers in the Prussian Military Academy, which was one of the first dedicated institutional military schools in the world. Prussian drill at this time emphasized the need for geometrical conformity, and the ability to march in near-perfect order. However, individual Prussian formations were usually smaller, and thus more mobile than their French counterparts. Lastly, men were conscripted into the army at age 20. Leading up to the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussian army was experienced and hardened by their recent wars against Austria and Denmark. The French army, on the other hand, was not as efficient, as it was less centralized and had a less continuous tradition after many regime changes over the years. Even with their experience in the recent Crimean War, French military doctrine was unpragmatic and could even be described as ideological. In the field, French theory was designed around mass charges and a strong offense, all features of Napoleonic warfare. With much larger formations, however, they could be encircled fairly easily. Like the Prussian army, the French army had mandatory conscription, and although the French army was initially larger, their mobilization failed to utilize railroads and infrastructure properly, and so by the time of the most significant battle of the war, Sedan, much of the army was still being mobilized. For that reason, Prussia held the advantage in drill and tactics. Technology is the last comparison between both armies. Each side had their own distinct advantages. The primary rifle for the Prussians was the needle gun. This rifle wasn't a bad weapon when it was first created, but it quickly became obsolete over the years, especially in comparison to the French Chassepot rifle. This rifle was not only more accurate than its Prussian counterpart, but it could be reloaded much faster. For this reason, we'll see some relatively high casualties on the Prussian side. The German equipment wasn't completely outdated, however. They make up for their loss in small arms with the employment of the Krupp gun. The Krupp gun was a steel artillery piece that was breech-loaded, meaning loaded from the back, and had a larger effective range than the primary French field gun, which was made of bronze and loaded in the front. The final weapon we're going to look at today is the Refi mitrailleuse, a French volley gun that fired 25 rifle rounds simultaneously. Initially, this weapon was kept so secret that no artilleryman actually knew how to use it effectively, and so the weapon was used like a normal long-range artillery piece in the beginning of the war, which proved rather indecisive. But once the French had more experience with this gun, it began dealing a fair amount of damage on Prussian forces. We can see this at the Battle of Gravelotte. With all of that said, we can assume that the French had a slight advantage over Prussian weaponry, but Prussian artillery had a large impact in some of these larger battles. Now on to the war. It's August 2nd, 1870. General Frossard's 2nd Corps and Marshal Bazaine's 3rd Corps cross the German border. Napoleon demands victory on German soil. August 3rd, 320,000 German soldiers mass near the French border, and quickly counterattack on August 4th in the Battle of Wissembourg. The Germans win. One day later, August 5th, the Germans attack again in the Battle of Forbach. the Germans win. With 2 victories secured, the German Third Army rapidly advances south, pushing the French 5th, 1st, and 7th Corps back. In an attempt to slow the German advance, French General MacMahon throws a massive cavalry charge in the Battle of Worth on the 6th of August. The French forces beat again. The German army continues south, occupying Nancy until further orders. With 3 rapid defeats, Napoleon orders a general retreat towards Verdun. He cedes command to François Bazaine and heads back to Chalon to raise more men. The French retreat in the north finds itself hindered by the rapidly advancing Prussian troops. Helmut von Moltke orders the French destroyed while on the retreat. At this point, most of the French forces have already been withdrawn to Metz, but now continue towards Verdun to rendezvous with more men. But movement is risky, as the Germans are on the pursuit. 30,000 German soldiers of the 3rd Corps are sent out of the Prussian 2nd Army to hunt down those retreating, and accidentally collide with 130,000 French troops on the 16th of August in the Battle of Mars-la-Tour. The Germans sustain heavy losses, and the battle proves rather inconclusive. But before the French army has any time to reorganize, they're hit again just 2 days later on August 18th at the Battle of Gravelotte, forcing Bazaine back to Metz, where they're now surrounded and under siege. Meanwhile, MacMahon has been ordered by Napoleon to lead the newly formed army of Chalons. His goal is now to break the siege at Metz and rescue Bazaine's corps. MacMahon marches 130,000 men out of Chalons on the 21st of August. Moltke spots the movement and orders a holding force to stay at Metz to keep Bazaine at bay, but at the same time moves a piece of his army to hit MacMahon in a pincer movement accompanied by the 3rd Army in the south, while MacMahon is on the march. On the 30th, Moltke's army engages MacMahon by surprise and forces him into Sedan. MacMahon deploys his men in a triangle around the town to take the high ground. Moltke's men quickly march around the town, cutting it off from any reinforcements. Unfortunately for the French, the Germans find even higher ground and begin a mass artillery bombardment a day later on August 31st. Now remember, at this point, the Germans are playing their advantage. In nearly every battle, the Germans have been taking substantial losses by the French repeating rifles, but now they're pinning the French with their superior artillery. Early the next day, September 1st, the German assault begins with the usual artillery bombardment, but this time it's followed by an assault on the outlying village of Bazay. Fighting there is intense. Hours later, MacMahon is wounded, and command is handed down to General Ducrot. He orders an attempt to break out of the German encirclement westward. As the troops begin to respond, General Emmanuel de Wimpfen arrives on the field from French Morocco and overrides the order from Ducrot. He redirects the troops to capture Bazay, but most of the troops are still confused at all of the conflicting orders. Meanwhile, Napoleon remains quiet. Later that day, a futile French attack results in the loss of Floing north of Sedan. With each French counterattack failing, the Germans continue constricting the French position with overwhelming artillery. By 4:30, Napoleon finally takes action, ordering the surrender of his army and himself. Napoleon's reign was over. The Prussians and their allies proceeded to Paris the following day, which held out until January 18th, 1871. Thank you for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons on Patreon for sponsoring this video: Joe, Jacob, James, Matthew, K-Squared, Aubrey, Derek, Emmanuel, Emerson, and Patrick. Big thanks to Derek, Emmanuel, and Emerson for being long-term sponsors, and a huge thanks to Patrick for the $10 pledge. I'd also like to thank my artist, Hert Boss, for making this video possible. Please join us next time for our video on the Russo-Japanese War. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.